Hi everyone. Today we're talking about Walt Whitman's When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. And our exercise for this little video is really just to understand a difficult poem. You know, because you're reading this poem, almost 150 years after it was written. So you know from the footnote at the end of the title that this poem was written immediately or very shortly after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But if you didn't know that, if you didn't have this footnote, or if you were, say, a contemporary reader of the poem, if somebody came to your door and said, I've just read this poem by Walt Whitman, I think it's beautiful, and they gave it to you without saying anything about what it's about, how would you know what it's about? How can you tell? It begins like a poem about a man who has stepped out into his backyard and is looking at the lilacs and looking at the night sky. So how do we understand what this poem is engaged in? On the one hand, we know that it's written about this massively important historic event. But on the other hand, it seems very, very private and personal. So let's just start at the beginning and sort of work our way through it. These first two lines, the lilacs of the title, the great star that drooped in the western sky in the night, we learn very quickly that these are going to be symbols, that they're going to tell us something more about what the poet is feeling. It's not only about the lilacs and the star. We know that he's mourning, and we know that at some level he never expects to recover. He's going to continue to mourn every time he thinks about this subject. And that's going to be annually, because lilacs bloom every year. The morning star, which is Venus, actually a planet, but we see it in the night sky on a cyclical basis. And he says, ever returning spring, you're going to bring this memory to me every year. When I smell the lilacs and see this star, I'm going to think of him I love. And then we hear more about the act of mourning. We hear how helpless he feels. He describes a particularly almost paralyzing kind of sadness. Today, we might call it we might use the language of depression, the harsh surrounding cloud. It's a grief that he can't tell whether it's going to end. It seems he feels entrapped, that he's going to continue to feel this sadness and powerlessness. As we keep moving, he oddly moves from this very passionate, very sad outcry, "Oh, shades of night, moody, tearful night," to this very quiet observation of the lilac with every leaf a miracle, right? So he's obviously not completely paralyzed. He feels this deep sadness, but he's interested in the lilac, and this is again how we know that it's going to become symbolic of something. What is this beautiful lilac meaning for him? Why is he breaking off this flower? Then he moves again from his own backyard or someone's backyard with a lilac bush to the swamp where a shy and hidden bird is warbling a song. It's a hermit thrush, and you see that tab there in the window. I tried to make it play for you, but I could not. But if you search for hermit thrush on YouTube, you can hear it. I'm sure you've heard this bird before because they winter here in Mississippi, and they really can put out some sound. Tiny little bird, very shrill, piercing voice. Whitman overtly, explicitly identifies with this bird. He's a solitary figure out there by himself in the swamp, but he sings, he provides a gift that people can hear from a great distance, because again, a very penetrating sound comes from this tiny bird. And Whitman also configures the bird as a figure for the poet by saying, this is your function in life. This is a gift you've received from creation, and it's the gift you provide to the people. If you could not do that, you could not live. Right now we're going to learn about who died. We find out that, and it's interesting how Whitman gives this to us, right? He begins with the landscape. Over the breast of the spring, the land, amid cities, amid lanes, and through old woods. He catalogs, and this is his mode of poetry. He's always just linking spaces, linking physical descriptions, linking details to put everything together. But here, as he links all these spaces of landscape, he's doing so to talk about the journey of a coffin. And here we begin to get the idea that this has to be someone important, right? Someone who has died far from home, and the coffin is being taken someplace else. We then learn that the coffin is passing through lanes and streets with the pomp of the in-looped flags, with cities draped in black, with the show of the states themselves. So this is an official figure. A silent sea of faces, the unbared heads, the waiting depot, the arriving coffin. So everywhere the coffin goes, there's ceremony. There are people gathered all around to see. This is, again, a period when bodies had been transported regularly, right? Soldiers' bodies coming back from the fighting. But the thing is that a town might come out to greet the person who had been lost. But here, everyone across the country is coming out to grieve this death. This is how we know that it's the leader of the nation, with the show of the states themselves, who is being mourned. And Whitman, the poet, I should say, the persona, the voice of the poet, is taking part in this mourning. I give you my sprig of lilac. And this, importantly, begins to tell us what lilac means also, right? It's beautiful. It's going to remind him of the death of Lincoln. But it's also something that you give to show that you care. It's a way of expressing how you, as a mourner, are linked through your love to the person who has died and to the other people who loved that person. Lilac in this poem functions as one sign of the ceremonies we engage in when someone has died, the way we bring each other food, the way we greet each other, the way we express sorrow and support for each other. The lilac here is symbolic of that kind of activity. And you'll notice that as in this poem, as it begins to address the process of grieving for Lincoln, it reaches out. That was a huge loss, of course, and Whitman was especially impressed with Lincoln. He shared some political beliefs with Lincoln. They were both opposed to slavery, but they were both especially concerned with union and preserving the Union, the United States as one nation. Whitman seems to have been very impressed with the way Lincoln conducted himself through the process of the war. And that matters because Whitman was as upset as anyone with what the war meant, the many deaths and the great destruction caused by the war. He spent a great deal of time in the hospitals trying to help wounded soldiers. He would assist nurses, but he would especially talk to the soldiers. He would sometimes read them poetry, but he would also chat with them about their loved ones back home and their experiences during the war. So he was very upset about what the country was going through, and Lincoln meant to him a kind of broad solace, a figure who was, in his mind, looking out for the country. So He's very sad about the death of Lincoln, but he immediately links it to all of these other deaths, right? Nor for you, for one alone. Blossoms and branches green, to coffins all I bring. Finally, I carol a song for you, O sane and sacred death. I bring sprigs from the bushes, with loaded arms I come, pouring for you, and the coffins all of you, O death. So there are so many dead people at this point that Whitman is trying to figure out how to mourn them all. What can he do that will somehow give voice to the loss that the country has experienced? We see by the end of this stanza that he begins to think about mortality more generally. O western orb sailing to heaven, here with the orb we're back to that star that he spoke about in the beginning of the poem, the evening star or morning star. And so here we see that Whitman is thinking back on this one single loss, and that the star here, it's associated both with specific grief for Lincoln, but also a form of grief that's fairly devastating, right? When you think about the single person who has been lost, if you focus all of your attention there, then that's going to leave your soul troubled and dissatisfied, because that person is not coming back to you. However much you can reconcile yourself to that loss by thinking about the afterlife, you have to face the fact that in this life, you've lost someone. It's very, very saddening. So Whitman pauses here to think about this loss and how he wished he had known what was going to happen. But then he immediately moves back to this hermit thrush, the singer, bashful and tender. He says, I hear, I come presently, I understand you, but a moment I linger. It's as if he's saying to this thrush, whom he's already suggested might be the voice of poetry in the process of mourning, I understand there is work to be done. I understand that this is part of what I should be doing. I too am a poet. I share your sense that our purpose is song. But right now the lustrous star has detained me. My departing comrade holds and detains me. I'm not ready to write poetry about this yet. I need to process this further. I'm still too devastated by my grief, he says.